Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of Iblis Manifestations Podcast. It's my absolute privilege to have my very good friend, Mr. Dayal Patterson, on today's episode of Iblis Manifestations. Dayal is an author, publisher, writer, as well as a journalist, and he is the head of the underground organization Cult Never Dies. Cold Never Dies are a publishing house, and they have worked with many notable names within the underground extreme metal scene. They have a wealth of culture behind the work that they do, and the bands that they have worked with include ones such as Psy, Necromantia, Beherit, Rotting Christ, and Balsagoth, and basically all of the old school greats that have been a part of not just the roster but the publishing aspects of their work. Dial has released multiple different books, different biographies on various different bands, and they've always offered a very unique perspective into the underground through their interviews, but also just through the products that they put out there. And as far as physical books are concerned, I can't personally think of anyone who has put out as much work as Dial has. As far as the publishing is concerned, where it is as thorough as it is, and it is as detailed, and also just as heartfelt, and it's all about the blood and the guts in the work that they've done. They've actually just recently done a new book. It's called Black Metal Evolution of the Cult. And in this book, they interviewed over 160 artists, and this included everyone from different underground bands and various others. And the idea is basically to get a full uh, idea of what this genre really stands for, where it came from, the impression that it leaves, as well as the many interesting different anecdotes that exist within the stories of each band and artist. So this is a massive, massive project, and I cannot recommend this enough. And they all really went above and beyond. Him and his team, they've done a great, great job for this book. So part of our conversation included talking about that book, but also we got to discuss just the history and the general scope of black metal, and what it is that this genre stands for, and what's really the real impression of black metal, because there's always a lot of presumptions. And with Dial being someone who's a genuine connoisseur and a follower of the cult ever since the 90s and so on, it felt like he was the perfect person to have that conversation with. And obviously, with myself having grown up in a country where that same genre is completely shunned, and it is illegal, and is something that you can get into serious trouble for, this made for a very interesting and dynamic conversation. And I should also add that if you're wanting to support this book, you can do so by visiting Cold Never Dies myshopify.com, and you can go and support it there. And I think it's a very interesting piece. If you want to support the underground, this is something that's different to perhaps purchasing a vinyl or a backpatch or a t-shirt. This is something that you can still hold in your hands and read through it and read the words of all of these artists, and get a general scope of black metal in general. So it is something that I very much do recommend you to do. I should also point out the fact that Cold Never Dies have also released my band Trivex's recent full-length album Iloa Burns Out. So if you happen to have lived under a rock and not heard the album yet, you can do so by either searching for it online, or if you wish to support it, then you can head over to either the Trivex Bandcamp page, or you can do so by going over to Cold Never Dies myshopify.com once again to get your own copies of the album. We do very much appreciate the support. So, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this new episode of Iblis Manifestations. We had an absolute blast, and I really enjoyed talking to Dale and just getting his knowledge and his perspective and viewpoint of this underground culture, which we all hold so dearly, was something that I found to be very insightful and valuable. And I hope that you will find it to be the same way. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dayal Patterson to Iblis Manifestations. Okay, Dayal, welcome to Iblis Manifestations, man. What a privilege to have you on the podcast. I guess it's about time that we finally do this, right?
Yeah, it's long overdue, I think.
I think so too. I think so too. But I guess we've got a pretty good excuse or a reason rather to do it this time. But before we start getting into everything, man, first off, how was the Damnation weekend just gone in Manchester?
It's very good, I think. It was definitely, I think it was much more black metal than the previous year. I think we felt we had a stage which had a lot of, basically six black metal bands, and you could see in the audience there was definitely much more black metal people there, or extreme metal people, I guess. So I think it was, yeah, it's not necessarily an event that people associate with death and black metal, because it is obviously quite a mix. But yeah, it's a good event, and a good mix of people, and quite a lot of people from our kind of world there. So yeah, it was good. And Psy played twice, so that's always, it's always good.
Yes. Yeah, I saw because obviously I was in Uppsala watching Wataine's 25th year anniversary, so
Right.
unfortunately I couldn't make it there. But that Psy performance looked absolutely fucking killer. I saw the picture with the sword and everything that,
Yeah,
that he came out with. That was fucking
yeah,
badass.
very theatrical. It's great, really, because Psy is obviously a band we've worked with for a long time, and
That's right.
yeah, I mean, I've been working with Mirai for over a decade now, so it's nice to have. And they played the Scorn Defeat set, and obviously we started when we started doing merch for them, we were doing just Scorn Defeat. So we kind of have that. It was kind of a nice thing to have on the Cult Never Dies stage, to have them playing the album in full, and then have the sort of best of set the next day, or normal black metal set. Yeah, so that was good, and we had a sign in for them and everything. So they brought the kids along, which was cool.
A signing.
Exactly. Yeah, you're not the first person to make that pun.
I'm sure I'm not. I'm certain that I'm not on that. But that's really cool, And then they're such a killer band, with just so much history, And they're always like such a unique standout act as far as our genre is concerned. It's really
Yeah,
cool to see them in that type of setting, And that's one thing I really like about Damnation is how they attract connoisseurs. Like they're
yeah,
very daring lineups that he always books, and I think that's really cool. And like you said, there may have only been like 5 or 6 black metal bands on there, which in the grand scheme of things, it might be more than before, but it's still not a lot. But
yeah,
it's cool, like you said, a lot of people who do listen to that style of music still do attend Damnation, And I have always attended there. It was just this year, I couldn't miss the Watain show, obviously. So
yeah. No, it was
yeah,
good, and that's not including bands like Enslaved and Catatonia as well that played the main stage.
yeah.
So Enslaved played their debut album through, and so it was very well curated in terms of having these sort of special sets, and then you had the Friday, which was they expanded it this year, so the Friday was almost as big an event as the Saturday,
All
and
right,
you had
cool.
these whole album sets, and I think it's quite. I mean, if you're a fan of a band and you get to see them 2 days running, I think that playing two completely different sets, I think that's something that's pretty unique, really.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, and to your point earlier as well, I think there is something to be said there because this is something that I have quite consistently seen at any UK events, where it's that it might be, let's say, a Bloodstock festival, which is really like at this point, it's the mainstream metal bands that
Mm,
predominantly play there. And I'm not saying that as a form of criticism. That's just the reality of it. There's nothing wrong with that, but I also think it's interesting that at those same festivals, obviously Damnation included as well, there is a very high influx of people with black and death metal t-shirts or merch or
yeah,
back patches. As someone who is obviously being directly involved in this, what do you think that is? Do you think it's just the aesthetic, or it's something that, or it's a signal that that's what people are demanding and that's what these festivals should be booking further? What do you think that is?
I would say that the popularity of extreme metal and death and black metal means that those festivals, obviously, you have festivals like Cosmic Void, Fortress, and Incineration, which is much more about that world, and
Sure.
then Damnation and Bloodstock, especially Bloodstock, is a broader church, I guess. There's more people, but we always, we used to do a stall with Season of Mist at Bloodstock, and we always had like a lot of book sales and people buying black metal stuff. So I think to some extent those big festivals, they even download. I've never worked at download, but I know people that have stalls selling black metal and death metal goods at download, and they do okay because I think people there's a certain type of person that maybe they don't necessarily like every band or even kind of identify with the festival totally musically, but it's a social event and it's something they're going to go to. So when they see something that represents death and black metal, it's like a beacon for them. It's something they can kind of spend time with, and probably make seeing King 318, whatever they're called, more palatable. They can
Sure.
survive by shopping or talking about black metal. And yeah, so I think, but especially Damnation is probably more in touch with black and death metal, I guess. And Bloodstock is, I think, now 12 to maybe 15,000 people. So I guess they have. Um,
I thought it was 20,000.
is it 20 now? Wow.
I
Okay. So,
feel like I remember maybe the last year or two being that, like the post-pandemic part of it, I remember being a
right.
lot larger than it
I
was
mean, that's a lot
before.
of people, and you'll have a headliner like Judas Priest, which
Yeah.
again is, I think most black metal people probably like Judas Priest and bands like that.
Fuck
Um,
yeah. They actually, the first year that we played Bloodstock, it was absolutely fucking perfect because I was doing press and interviews all day. This was in August 2018. I was
okay,
doing interviews all day. Then we got ready, and then we did the show. And as our set finished, Emperor went on main stage. So
right,
we immediately put our stuff in the car, ran to the main stage, and watched Emperor. And I actually cried because it was the first time I was seeing them, and
okay,
the whole thing was just really fucking. When they played Lost and Curse of Reverence, I found it really overwhelming because that was like one of my fucking go-to songs in Iran. I
right.
absolutely, had so many memories with it. And then immediately, obviously after Emperor, it was Judas Priest playing. So I was like on cloud 11 by that
Yeah,
point.
I
And
mean
and
that
it does
world is,
work.
yeah, and it's part of the same universe. I think if you had something like, it's not a festival where you're going to have something like Limp Bizkit or something that's kind of completely out of kind of the metal canon.
Mm-hmm.
I think people will go. Yeah, I think they're quite different. I mean, Damnation and Bloodstock's quite different kind of worlds, I guess. I feel like the lineup for Damnation tends to tally more with maybe Decibel magazine, whereas Bloodstock would be more like Metal Hammer. There's that slightly different, take
I
on things.
think, yeah, I think that's a pretty good analysis, I would say, or
Mm.
interpretation. Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, it's good to have some sort of representation at these big events. I think that you do need some you do need some sort of visibility at this sort of stuff. And I think, to be fair, Damnation, although it's a more it is a maybe more mainstream event to some extent. They have had bands like, you have Rotting Christ headlining the stage, and, Heathen Deity, one of our bands, has played there. You've
Mm-hmm.
played there. So it's there is some sort of, you know, there is some sort of connectivity between it all, and I think that's why we feel it's good to be represented at those festivals, even though obviously something like Cosmic Void is more like representing, I guess, almost 100% what we would, you know, the bands that are booked at Cosmic Void is almost 100% what Cult Never Dies covers. But there's,
Hmm.
you sort of need both those events, because I think people don't start off going to shows like Cosmic Void. You know, people come into the scene through things like
Mm.
Bloodstock and then Damnation and then Cosmic Void, and that's all kind of.
Yeah,
I think that's, you
we
need to have.
slowly corrupt them.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You have to have this kind of entry level, you know, and not. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but you have to have different layers, and unless you want to be totally closed off to the mainstream or to the mainstream of metal, then you have to kind of leave the doorway open a little bit. You know, I don't think we would ever do. Obviously, I don't think Gold Never Dies would ever do a stage at say Download,
Hmm.
because it wouldn't be in our interest or theirs. You know, but at the same time, you know, I think if we did a stall there, which we, you know, we probably wouldn't, but if we did, I think, in my experience, you would get people coming over just because of that factor that people just like to go to events. You know.
I mean, I wouldn't put that too far away from the realm of possibility, especially now that, I mean, I guess, like you put it, and this is, I don't mean this in a negative or insulting way whatsoever. It's just the reality of things. But let's say now when you have Behemoth playing the main stage at Download
That's true. Yeah.
twice, I think that that creates a lot of attraction. And then you obviously have movies like Lords of Chaos. Now whether you like it or not, that's its own thing. But nevertheless, these are mainstream culture waves that occur, and people, especially younger people, do become curious, and that's where it all starts. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
like how you get introduced to it, but a lot of times that's where it starts. And then, I'm sure, like you said, the case of Limp Bizkit. Limp Bizkit might have actually been the first metal band that I heard when I was a 9-year-old kid in Iran watching
Right.
bootleg videos of WrestleMania. You know what I mean? When
That's,
they were,
yeah. I guess so. I guess
yeah.
so. I always feel like there's not so much. My issue with new metal is that, as well as being terrible music, it was kind of, there was no connection to there was no connection to the metal scene in a sense. I don't think. I mean, that would be an exception, but I think there's a sort of metal canon where people get into something like Iron Maiden or Megadeth or Metallica, and that can kind of, there's a sort of established pathway to the rest of the metal scene, or the broader world, I guess.
Mhm.
And even stuff like maybe Slipknot. You know, people might get into Slipknot. I never did, but that's probably an age thing. But you know, people would get into Slipknot, and then maybe they'd be interested in hearing Suffocation, or you know, Slayer or
Sure.
something like that. And then there's a sort of like some sort of trickle down effect where, you know, if 1 million people get into Slipknot, then maybe 100,000 people get into Arch Enemy, and 10,000 people get into, you know, whatever.
Beherit.
It kind of reaches us, you know. But I think with my issue with stuff like Limp Bizkit is that, no, I mean, with the exception maybe of someone in Iran who's, you know, not not plugged into the world in the same way, or the metal world,
Sure.
most people who got into Limp Bizkit never went much deeper than that, it seems to me. You know, like, you know, you wouldn't get, you could, you know, you could go and see Metallica, and there's quite an obvious lineage to the things that they were inspired by. You know, they were obviously inspired by Venom, and you know, Slayer obviously have connections to Venom and stuff like that. So there's that way in. Whereas Limp Bizkit, I don't think any of it, you know, those guys listen to metal as we would know it, or even proper hip hop. If you know, for me, it was kind of like the worst of both of those worlds put together. You know, that's new metal. It's like people that have no culture taking the worst aspects of metal, marrying it to the worst elements of hip hop.
It's an interesting take. I think that I definitely see where you're coming from. I think what it is that it's, to your point earlier, it's that the entry level which you talk about. So we had Judas Priest as the example of that. I think, to me, I guess if you really want to strip it down and be the absolute elitist, there is this thing that listening to let's say Thin Lizzy, Deep Purple, Rainbow, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Metallica, Motorhead, Slayer, that's all fine.
Yeah,
And then listening to, let's say, Blasphemy, Beheaded, Bathory, Dissection, Mayhem, Sarcophago, that, like, all of those bands, they're also okay. But
right.
then listening to, I don't know, Korn or Limp Bizkit or Slipknot or My Chemical Romance or I don't know, like any of those bands, that's somehow not okay. It's a very
Yeah,
interesting thing, that, for
yeah,
me. But I can see, well, obviously, I think it's pretty obvious where the issue is. I just think that there is that interesting thing. And I would probably say that, at least personally, I feel the same way about grunge as well. I just feel like that was a very unfortunate thing that happened in music at that time, because the greatest wave of death metal was happening in the late 80s, early 90s, and
right.
it feels like as soon as grunge came in, it kind of fucked things up for
But I
anything
think
in
maybe
metal.
like rock was kind of at its most mainstream, I guess, in say the early like late 80s to early 90s, and I suspect that that was part of the reason that death and black metal was so explosive, was because it was kind of going against that. And even if I think about like the years of new metal, it's the 90s. That was when the best, a lot of the best black metal came out. And certainly when I was, when I was getting into black metal, the people that got into black metal, let's say in 1990, 1991, there was an element of rebellion against sort of death metal and hardcore. But by the time I was getting into it in the mid 90s, I guess new metal was kind of what we were kind of what we would not want to, that was the mainstream that we were trying to get away from. And I think honestly, I think if people enjoy stuff, you should listen. People should listen to whatever they want. If someone enjoys Limp Bizkit, um, that's okay.
It's not okay with you, but it's okay for them.
It's okay with me for them to listen to it. I think the
Sure.
problem is my fear is, for me, it's a different thing now, because I'm I don't have this. I don't have too emotional a connection to that. But I remember being, let's say, a teenager and kind of hating that stuff, or hating. I think most of the people in the underground. I don't think anyone that's in the underground and has a genuine impact on the underground or contribution to it. I don't think any of those people get there without it's as much rejecting something. It's as much about identifying what you're not into as what you are into. And you can say that of any like youth movement. Like punks were not only creating something new in, let's say, 75, 76, but they were also defining themselves as not part of the kind of prog rock stadium bands. And in the same way, I think people that are into black and death metal, especially when they get into it, I think at my point in life, I don't care too much what other people listen to. But when you're a teenager, probably all your friends who are into, say, heavier music are into the mainstream of heavy music. And so the people that go into something, it doesn't even have to be black metal. It could be, underground drum and bass, or, dancehall or hip hop, or anything. It doesn't really matter. But I think when you get more deeply into those things, of course, you sort of want to distance yourself from whatever the mainstream is. And so in my era, that was new metal. And now, I don't really know what I don't know what the mainstream of metal looks like now so much, because I'm not trying to be connected to that world. But I think it's okay to, obviously these days there's this kind of it's very on trend to say, to be anti-elitist and to be against gatekeepers and all this nonsense. But metal is about gatekeeping. The underground is about gatekeeping to an extent, because there's never been an underground scene, whether it's punk or hip hop or black metal or anything, that didn't distance itself, didn't explicitly distance itself from certain things, because otherwise you could say that Metallica is black metal. Obviously, that wouldn't make sense. You have to. It doesn't mean it's bad, but you have to build. You do build a wall around what is. And I think people got to become very confused about that. That this is some sort of negative thing. It's not about being negative. It's about setting out what you're trying to contribute to and be a part of. And I think the underground that is a big part of it. It's not if you had anything being in the it's a bit like when Judas Priest appeared on The Simpsons,
Right.
and The Simpsons described them as a death metal band.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And everyone said they're not a death metal band. Now, there's nothing against The Simpsons, there's nothing against Judas Priest, but Judas Priest aren't a death metal band. They're one of my favorite bands, but they're not a death metal band. So that's not an elitist. That's not like a death metal people being elite. And it's the same as when someone says like Death Heaven isn't black metal, or doesn't mean I'm saying Death Heaven is terrible. It's just there are lines
Yeah.
that you draw, and it's the same, I guess, with mainstream music. Like my issue with new metal was the fact that it became so championed by the mainstream,
Hmm.
and at the expense of other things. At the expense of. I mean, you have to remember, like in the '90s, when I got into this, for example, a band like Emperor wouldn't be in a normal metal magazine, but Limp Bizkit or Mudvayne or whatever, that was what was being pushed.
Hmm.
Feeder, this kind of stuff, that was what was on the cover. And Emperor wouldn't even get a review, or they'd get a negative review or something. So the world's changed a bit, obviously, now, because the metal media doesn't exist in the same way. There's not the internet has kind of freed all that up. So maybe that's a good thing. Maybe there's a good side and bads to that.
I think the what my impression of it is. By the way, that Simpsons episode was quite funny because on the next episode, on the intro where Bart is writing on the blackboard, he is
Right.
writing Judas Priest are not a death metal band. Judas Priest
Yeah.
are not a death metal band. As if
They
like,
acknowledge that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That was I thought that was a good touch. I think one of the main things that I'm taking away from this as well is that certain movements within metal, especially I think black metal, I think that there's an edge of intellectualism attached to it, which
I'd hope
perhaps
so.
I would say so because I
Yeah.
think that, and just as far as the characteristics, because I think that each, let's call it a fan base. I think that each fan base and a certain demographic represents or at least reflects what is present within a certain subgenre or subculture even, or
Yeah.
counterculture even. And I think that a lot of us, especially those who get into the much darker and deeper side of black metal specifically, which is about as deep and dark as a musical subgenre can get, at least as far as I'm concerned, I
Mm.
think that it's very much the character. There's a specific characteristics to those kind of people. They're generally much more introverted. They're generally a lot more driven towards intellectualism, towards a certain specific darkness, have a different overview of the world. And I think that what we hate in other people is usually things that we've rejected within ourselves. So then
Right.
when you have a subculture, a new one coming through with, like, let's say kids who follow Limp Bizkit or I don't know, let's say Slipknot or whatever, and I'm not taking away from those bands by saying this, but there's like a certain loudness associated to it, like people are a little bit more perhaps obnoxious, a little bit more, even if they're angsty, they go about it in a way that to us is a little more alien, because instead of us choosing to be kind of like whingy and whiny like they might be, we instead chose to focus on intellectualism, to focus on
Yeah. I
the
think
aspects of
underground.
the occult. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? That's,
I
I
think
think, the kind of difference that I see
yeah.
there.
Yeah. I think underground metal has always had kind of, especially black metal, has always had artistic and intellectual aspirations in a way that. But I think also it's about superficiality. I think
Mm.
most subcultures are attempting to get away from being superficial, whereas the mainstream, any popular movement, whether it's you know new metal or metalcore or whatever happens to get that boom and broader exposure, it obviously gets people that are more casual. And I think probably superficiality and casuality is sort of what metal fans and maybe participants in any subculture and subgenre are trying to get away from. So that's where there's a kind of there's a sort of tension there with if you at a big rock festival you will have bands. A lot of bands will be there. Obviously, you'll have your main headliners, which are probably bands, might be like Judas Priest or Kiss or all these classic bands. And then the next level tends to be the bands that are very hyped and they're very big for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of those people that are into that probably won't be into it in 5 or 10 years, and then they probably won't go any deeper than that. Maybe they're into Parkway Drive, but then they don't check out any other kind of metalcore or something like that. I mean, that's a scene I'm not really plugged into, but there's the sort of people that go to big rock festivals just want to have a good time, a lot of them. So, which is fine, but that's the difference. I think I don't think you get many people that go to Damnation or especially Cosmic Void who are kind of casual, or
Right.
those bands, they're not really available. It's not really visible. Like, how would you know about that stuff? You sort of have to put in time, research it, or even if that research is just sort of looking on YouTube or Spotify, you have to do a bit more work. Whereas if you go to a festival and it's like Aerosmith, Kiss, Judas Priest or whatever, it's like everyone knows that stuff. Just go along and.
Yeah,
So, but you need that.
absolutely.
Nobody gets into this stuff, like nobody gets into the underground direct, straight away. So it's like you kind of need that level of. I'm not condemning that at all, but it is a cult never dies, especially is an attempt. Has always been an attempt to kind of set up a media outlet which doesn't have those mainstream pressures. If
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean. Like, I worked for Metal Hammer for many years. I worked for NME and magazines that you can say are kind of more mainstream and cover mainstream stuff. And there's definitely
Absolutely.
a place for that stuff. But I suppose with Cult Never Dies, especially, it's about sort of having the same channels without having to rely on that world, or just sort of separating yourself from them, almost taking the media out of literature and sort of taking the media culture away from creating media in a way. And I think that's quite important. In the same way that you have underground labels that handle underground forms of music, there was a lack of sort of publishing which did the same thing. Maybe I think in the 90s and 80s you had you had this very big fanzine culture, and that's obviously changed with the internet, but you lose something with just doing stuff online. So if you can then bring back, and I think it's quite important that it's important to have all these channels available for any subculture, or any form of music, that you have high quality literature, high quality videos, high quality, because there's such a deluge of content now online. There's never been more people kind of doing stuff in any field, and especially in like you see it, especially in metal and extreme metal. There's just a million people doing different. So to stand out from that, you have to kind of do it properly, whereas before you probably just had to do it and that was already enough to be of interest.
Absolutely. I think it really speaks on also just the depth of this particular cultural movement, really. Like I said, it becomes so much more than, oh, I'm angsty, this or that. No, there's like so much stories, and the scene, if you can call it that, is comprised of such colorful characters, especially,
Right.
and this is all I could think of when I was looking through your book. Is like
Okay.
it was a reminder to me, like, oh yeah, holy shit, these are the kind of people whose music I listen to and I am friends with, and it was
Yeah.
like a reminder, like, oh yeah, this is still a thing. But I think that's actually exactly what makes it so special. I don't think there's many other types of cultural movement where you would as frequently as black metal come into such depth within the stories of the artists, what
Definitely.
happened to them, what they did, And I'm not taking away from any other style, but I'm just saying, like, as far as the consistency of just how frequent it is to be getting that kind of content, as you put it. And I think that you need that extra angle. Like, listening to the music on its own is fucking great, but then there's so many different other angles to it, and that's why I think it is so valuable to have the likes of what you do with Cult Never Dies, or even Bardo Methodology, or dare I
Yeah,
say Iblis Manifestations, where
yeah,
you get to hear that in-depth perspective of what these artists think and what they've
yeah,
been through. How do they even think that they reached at a conclusion that they decided to create this absolute monstrosity as a form of music? Does that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah. And it also, I think, it gives it context because it's so easy now.
Hmm.
The good thing with the internet is you can plug into anything instantly. So if you want to listen to like a Von demo, it's one click away.
Yeah.
Whereas like when I was a kid, you had to find somebody that either had the split with Dark Funeral or would copy it on a tape, or so now everything's instantly accessible, which is great. But on the other hand, it means that people tend to plug into stuff and they lose the context of it because they haven't kind of gone through the stages.
Right.
And I think that's why metal media, in a way, not the metal media, but things like videos, high quality videos, books, fanzines. In a way, they're more important than ever because it was impossible to get into, for example, let's say Emperor back in the day without going through a few stages. You would have had to almost, it would be almost impossible to get into Emperor when they were kind of still around as a functioning band without knowing some people who were into it or reading some interviews, or it's just you wouldn't be able to plug into that unless you happen to go to um like a specialist record store, see the album, you like the cover, maybe you bought it, but in most cases you'd have had to go through some stages to get there. And I think now, because you can just see something on social media, it's like, I'll go, I'll check that out. And that's good in a way, but what it means is you lose the meaning behind it sometimes, or you lose the context. And especially in black
Yeah.
metal, there's so much, as you said, it's with this new book, there's 165 people in it, and none of them are just in it for the riffs or whatever. There's literally, like, I would say that's like 165 characters. There's no one in that book I
Yeah.
can say is just like making music for a laugh or whatever. And
Yes.
so you kind of need that extra information because you won't get it from just watching something on YouTube. And unfortunately now, I think maybe for younger people as well, there's a temptation just to, you listen to something on Spotify. You might go to a show, which is great, but there's a sort of disconnect that didn't used to exist. You didn't used to be able to be into black metal without being quite seriously into black metal. And
Hmm.
now there's a generation of kind of casual black metal listeners, which
Yeah, that doesn't
it's
sit
not,
well with me. I know what you're
yeah,
saying. But
it
the
doesn't
same
fit
applies to
naturally.
bands as well. There are a lot of bands, I would say, especially in the UK scene. Not to be
Yeah,
that guy, but there's a lot of that I see that I can immediately recognize that, oh, yeah, you're just doing this because you think it's cool. Like, one thing
absolutely.
that's extremely alarming to me is, obviously I won't name names, but then when I'll speak to friends, and by the way, this is not something I'm just saying here. That same person that I'm making the example of, I've spoken to them and told them exactly what I'm about to say. But
Okay.
their case was, this is someone from a band that's very well respected, and they are actually, I would say, a very good band also. But uh, I find it very uncomfortable when someone from a band like that, that's getting so much attraction nowadays, now that they're coming up, they're really like getting heard, will say something like, oh yeah, it's crazy with black, you can just like write any riffs, as long as it sounds a certain way, people will love it, they'll think it's the best thing ever. And
Right.
I almost like take offense to that. And I said to him, I said, like, it's not about how people like it. It's about your own artistic integrity. It's
Yeah.
about meaning what you do. And it's about doing it not because you think it's cool, but because you need to do it. You
Yeah.
need to have this catharsis through this music and black metal. I think to me, it's actually kind of a sacred thing with this musical genre, which is I think that's a I don't like that when I don't measure the purity of something just based on what it sounds like, but rather the intent. But I think as I've gotten older, I realize this applies to both the artist as well as the listeners. And the fact that anyone will just buy it because they think it sounds cool is a little bit like, I think it's kind of missing the point. And I think that's actually a very, very accurate reflection of the state that you're describing there.
Yeah, we were talking about this actually with at Damnation. There was six of the guys from Fault Never Dies there, and we were talking about there was Jim from Heathen Deity and Frank from Fen and Steve, and we were having this conversation about some of the UK bands and a band that's now defunct, but one of the guys gave an interview where he said like black metal is just music, and that would never have happened in an earlier era because well, firstly, you'd have had a really bad feed. You'd have faced some sort of negative feedback or reaction from the scene.
Probably got death threats, I would say.
Yeah, or at least people would have said, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But secondly, you would never have got to the stage where you could be playing in a black metal band and just have no clue about the culture. To be that clueless and still be in to be playing in a band that would be self-described as black metal, and to be that clueless about the culture, it didn't really happen before because you wouldn't have found out about it without almost unwillingly kind of finding out about the culture and how things were. Whereas now people can just plug into something they like. You can plug into an Immortal album on YouTube and you think, oh, I'm going to do that, and you don't know anything that goes behind it. And to be fair, in a lot of cases, I think that's obvious in the music and the performances and the art. I think it's quite a hard thing to fake, but it has to be said there is a weird, in the last 10 years, about 10 years ago, you had this influx of people from the hardcore scene who got into black metal. I would say that was kind of early 2010s. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But then you had bands which were formed by people who were kind of from the hardcore scene and liked some black metal. Because there was always people that liked hardcore and black metal. That wasn't the issue. But there was this influx of people who were kind of had been exposed to maybe the mainstream of black metal, came from a hardcore background. Then they formed bands and then they make music which is like black metal influenced post-hardcore or whatever. And their fan base is then kind of a hardcore fan base that likes a bit of black metal. And so you have this weird sort of overlap, and I'm not saying that's a problem because I think some of those people will then dig deeper and understand, and it's not a problem to be into hardcore. But I guess my issue with it is I think there's been a certain degree of, and the last chapter of the book is all about this really, how there's kind of been a cultural appropriation of black metal, because record labels and bands will describe a band as being black metal because they know that will sell better and sound better than saying post-hardcore with a few black metal influences or shoegaze with a bit of mutilation. It's like they know that if you call something black metal, it has this weight. But the thing is, the weight is built on 40 years of, firstly, important music that sounded more extreme, but also, more inaccessible. Ideology, whether it's Satanism or misanthropy or, there's a history there, church burnings, murders, and less dramatic things, just the history of how let's say the culture has evolved. And so you're trying to trade off that, but you don't want to be part of it. And for me, that's the only issue. I don't mind if a group of people like Death Heaven and Merca and Ghost Bath and they call that black metal, like I'm too old now to care. You know what I mean? Like when I was in my teenage years or early 20s, I'd have been really angry about that. I don't care about that. But there is a cultural appropriation going on when you try and sell that as black metal, And it's not just the bands. For example, Deaf Heaven have stated, and I do quote them in the book, that they're not black metal, and they never thought anyone would consider them black metal. But I've had conversations with academics who would say, well, the argument tends to go, black metal people and culture is narrow-minded because they won't accept Merca and Deaf Heaven and all this stuff as black metal. And then you want to say, well, that's because it's not black metal, but that's almost confirming their argument in the first place. They just say, oh, you're narrow-minded. So there's this weird paradigm where I think a lot of bands are sort of using black metal now as a sales tool, which is something that big bands, Cradle of Filth, when they stopped being, let's say, pure black metal, when they broke into the mainstream, Danny was always very quick to say, we started off as a black metal band, now we're doing something a bit different, because he knew, he listened to, toured with Emperor, he knew Necromantia, and he knew what underground black metal was, so he knew that he wasn't part of that. Mm-hmm. But I think the awkward thing is, the tension is there now, is that you have bands which have taken aspects of black metal, which is okay, but then they're kind of trying to make something more musically accessible and more mainstream. And that's a problem in a way, because black metal was always supposed to be, black metal was explicitly, and when I say explicitly, I mean that the people who invented black metal were literally stating this is supposed to be a counter to the rest of metal. It's whether it's Euronymous or Varg or Dead, or all these people are very explicit about that they were making something which wasn't supposed to be mainstream. Now, it's not a problem if you become mainstream without compromising. You could say Watain were an example of that. Dark Throne, there's plenty. I mean, Dark Throne outsell most mainstream bands. Mm-hmm. The early stuff, which what I mean, but it's still obviously black metal. So it's not a problem that you reach a wider audience or that you achieve greater success, but it's when bands, I think there's a tension when bands take any underground movement and then try and commodify it, and then also don't kind of make clear that they're doing something different. So if a band comes out playing hardcore black metal crossed, and it's on X fairly commercial metal label, you know what I mean? It's like, to me, there is a degree of cultural appropriation. That sounds over dramatic to some people, but it is, it's not the end of the world, but it is a genuine appropriation of a pre-existing culture, and a culture that set itself up to be explicitly not what that is.
But I think that one of the weirdest things about that is simply the fact that someone would approach music writing in a way of, oh, I'm gonna write this genre and then I'm gonna mix it with this. Like, I never understood that. Like, to me, as an artist, I write what I write because it feels right to me. And almost, even though black metal has been such a big part of my life since I was a teenager in Iran, I almost I'm not doing it to fit in. I write what I write because it feels right to me, because it's an accurate way for me to describe myself, and that's why, obviously, with the album that we released together, thank you, by the way, I have to say, for on the record, for partaking in such a big part of our journey, and taking a chance on us. But that album, all of the reviews, like everyone, I know they say not to read the reviews or pay attention to the comments, but I have done, and almost everyone says how diverse it is. And I always say, well, that's because I'm not trying to fit in. I'm just writing what feels right to me, and I know exactly what the intent behind that is. Right. It's kind of like in the same way that Judas Priest in the let's say 70s were heavy metal, but almost by accident, because it wasn't quite a thing yet, but that was just their natural expression as a band, and then it ended up becoming that thing. It was the same with Motorhead, where it was like a mixture of like heavy metal and punk. I guess Slayer were kind of the same thing, and then they were the bands that also brought these groups of people together. I think that as an artist, it's a fucking weird thing to sit down and say, let me scroll through all the different genres on Spotify, and then I'll choose one of them and I'll write a song that sounds like the rest of that. It's like, well, where's your authenticity then? On one hand as well, I will say that this does in some ways create a little bit of a dilemma as well, I would say. And I'll make a case of that. Like for me as a person, my personal approach to not just music, but actually most things in life is that I'm going to do things my way.
Right.
And by that, I mean that I am not going to give in to pressure. Okay. Now, that same token, I think that's an attitude that is extremely powerful within our counterculture movement. I think
Mhm.
it is what makes it what it is. It is what makes it the fuck you to everything else that's out there, that's accessible or whatever.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, there are then rules and guidelines within that same counterculture. So
Yeah. I mean,
the her
there
the
are, yeah, I
yeah,
think that's true. There is a sort of, yeah, I don't like to use the word rule. I don't feel I don't, yeah, it's a tricky one. The dilemma is I don't feel on the one hand like a band should have to obey rules. Because if I think of stuff like Arcturus, they became a kind of groundbreaking, amazing band because they broke rules and they
exactly.
were kind of. So I think it's okay. I just think some of this stuff is more to do with marketing. Like I don't have a problem with a band mixing, let's say, shoegaze with black metal if that's what they want to do. That's fine. I suppose my issue with it is more the fact that record labels and magazines will then market that as black metal,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of dilutes and causes confusion about what black metal is then, and I don't think
Yeah,
black metal is so fragile that it has a problem with I think it's not a problem in the sense that doesn't affect black metal in a negative way, but I think it's natural whenever anything kind of claims to be something that it's not. I think it's okay to say that, and like Judas Priest being labeled death metal, it's just natural to say, oh, it's not, that's not death metal. And one of the things I was thinking, actually, I did this talk at Cosmic Void, and I was we did a panel talk, and my part of it was kind of what I considered to be good examples of metal journalism and bad examples of metal journalism, and or not, let's say, journalism about metal rather than metal journalism. And I remember the one that sticks out for me as a bad example that I brought up was there's an article well, it was on Vice, and this is nothing against Vice because they were quite supportive of the book and all the rest of it, but there was an article called Why Are Black Metal Fans Elitist Arseholes? And it's basically 1,000 words about a guy that went to a metal bar. There was a couple of guys behind the bar wearing black metal t-shirts or patch jackets, and he said, "I like black metal. I like Death Heaven." And then they said, "Well, that's not black metal." And that was enough for him to be inspired to write like 1,000 words about gatekeeping and elitism. And to me, it's so daft because
yeah.
it's just and if you react against that, that's the thing. You've got this huge, in the last few years, this huge wave of people, especially on social media, crying about gatekeep, and even magazines then picking up on this and being anti-gatekeeper and all this stuff. But it just seems so sort of the people that moan about gatekeeping are the people that gates were built to keep out. To me, it just seems so lame to be like, well, I'm not allowed in the club, because to me, there's also a sort of arrogance about it, because and that's kind of why I created this book in the first place, because when I started writing the first edition, it was 2009, and it was when black metal had started to become more exposed to, let's say, outsiders. That happened, I would say, around the mid 2000s, and suddenly you had a lot of people writing articles about black metal, making films, and just sort of having no idea about it, but just making a film or a documentary or an article anyway. And so it was sort of these sort of half truths were becoming almost like accepted. It's like the story of black metal is Norway from 91 to 93. It's about Burzum and Varg and Euronymous, and it's like taking this huge thing and turn it into a little caricature.
It's like the
And so
more you repeat something, it eventually becomes true.
exactly, and it becomes like this sort of yeah, this sort of false mythology. You know, it's almost like religion. It's like if you keep telling these distorted stories, eventually a load of people start believing in it, you know? And so my reason for writing the book was to give the artists to tell the story properly and say, look, it's not just about Norway from 91 to 93. Let's go right back to 1980 and track it through and, you know, talk about other scenes and all the rest of it. But anyway, I sort of, it's about, you know, you just sometimes have to set the story straight, and it's nothing to do with gatekeeping or being negative or, you know, if I went into a new scene, which I have done, I would want to sort of, you know, I don't just listen to metal. I listen to a lot of different types of music, and for example, I listen to a lot of, I would say, sort of the more urban side of contemporary Jamaican music, right? And I have some,
Interesting.
yeah, and I have some connection in those scenes, but only as a fan. Whereas, you know, uh, I don't, I'm not involved in, you know, I'm not writing about it or involved in the infrastructure in the same way I am with the metal stuff. But I wouldn't dare to go into that scene. You know, I've been into that, let's say 10, 15 years now. But, you know, when I got into it, I didn't go in and start telling people what was what. To me, that just seems so arrogant. It's like going into a university lecture in your first year and you start telling the professor he's wrong about stuff. It's like you're, you know, there's a weird arrogance about this gatekeeping rubbish where it's like, I'm a fan of it, therefore you must accept what I say. And this kind of, you know, my opinion is as worth as much as yours, even though I don't really know about it. And I just think that's actually that's a broader problem in society. You know, you could say that was a sort of, you see that in America a lot. I think in the last decade, where it's like people who are against science, even, you know, certain presidents who would be like, my opinion is worth more than your education, almost like, you know, I'm allowed to believe what I want. So if I want to believe in creationism, then that's as you know, that's worth as much as your knowledge of Darwin. You know, it's like, that's not how the world works. You know, there is sort of, if people come into something and they're new to it, they ought to, it's not about gatekeeping or sort of elitism. It's just you ought to sort of find out what the facts are and sort of be respectful of that, not just come into something and, you know, and a lot of this stuff I see these days on social media is this sort of people saying, well, it's just this sort of false, this straw man argument where it's kind of, there was a guy recently and he posted, I won't name him, but he was another sort of fairly clueless character, and he posted, my favorite black metal album is Cradle of Filth Midian. And, you know,
Was
so
he
where do you
being
start?
sarcastic or did he
No, I
actually mean
thought,
it?
no, you would hope so, but no, I think it was genuine. And of course, you'd want to say, like, not only is that not the best Cradle of Filth album, not only is it the album where Cradle of Filth consciously stopped being black in metal. You know, there's so many things you could poke about that, but it's almost like now if you do that, if you engage with that, suddenly somebody will go, well, who are you to say, you know, I think it's black metal, therefore it's black metal. You know, it's this
Hmm.
kind of argument, and it's just weird to see. You just have to, you can't worry too much about it because it would drive you mad. But I think it's perfectly natural that people correct stuff that's wrong. And I think in black metal, to go back to the book, there's so much misconception. Black metal is such a difficult genre to understand. And I don't mean that in a pretentious way, or I don't mean to be pretentious, but if you're not into black metal, and I see that a lot as well, is that a lot of people say like black metal is humorless, and like people that are into black metal have no sense of humor, and it's rubbish. Like, I mean, you know, the last 2 days, most of it was spent just laughing behind the stall, talking about black metal and other things. There's nothing to do with that, but uh, I feel like people on the outside, they can't tell the bits which are tongue in cheek, and they take that too seriously, and then they can't take the serious stuff. They don't understand that that's serious, and it's not an easy genre to understand. It's not, you know, there's so many layers to it. I would dare to say more than almost any other genre of music. There's so much layers of content and context.
I'm really glad that you actually brought that up because this reminds me, like, I fully relate to this part in the sense that I remember some years ago when Trivex first started in the UK, we were in Birmingham, okay, and Birmingham at that time. Now, obviously, I was very grateful that I finally had the opportunity to perform live, but there was a part of me as well that was actually extremely disappointed because at that time that was the uprising of all these fucking bands with like a million letters for their names,
Right.
like all this and all these kids with their stupid haircuts and stretched out ears, so to me I found that quite revolting. And I was, even though I was still very young at that time, I was quite young when I moved to the UK, but
Mm.
I still had Behexen blasting out in my ears, and that was and Watain and Mayhem and Marduk, and that was the scene that I was very much interested in, and I was actually a little bit of surprised that, oh, I thought this was the home of metal,
Right.
not metal core, and
Yeah.
and that I found that very disappointing. But obviously over time, that's kind of died off. I would like to think that perhaps maybe even in some minuscule way we might have even had a part in that, at least as far as those particular areas are concerned. But one thing about it that is very interesting when you say humorless. I remember specifically in Birmingham, and especially there were bands that would, for example, name themselves party black metal.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen that, but that to me, that's like an oxymoron. Like
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
there's like, it's like you're already missing the point and you're only at the name of the band, and
Yeah.
then it would always I respect the I guess the market aspect of it, that if something is more popular for a while, that's what the agents and promoters will book. But there was a part of me that was I wasn't frustrated because my band wasn't getting booked, but I was frustrated that of all of the things within this weird and wonderful genre, with all of that depth, that was the shit that we were paying attention to.
Yeah.
Just like you and I were talking the other day, where you said that in like, what was it, in 2014 or something? You said that, was it? What was the name of that band that you said had more people watching it than Emperor?
Oh, it's Bloodstock.
Yes, yeah. Remind
Yeah,
me,
that's right.
what band was it again?
Yeah, that was so Evil Scarecrow playing
Right.
the same
Yes.
stage as Emperor playing Nightside Eclipse, and the crowd were bigger for Evil Scarecrow, which
Explain
kind
to
of
me, like,
tells you,
how does that happen? Like, how
you
can
know,
we fuck it up so badly?
yeah. And that's yeah. I mean, I think comedy metal is sort of it is the last refuge of people that don't have much sense of humor, But I really have an issue with, and this is another thing that kind of feeds back into what I was saying about the appropriation, is that there's certain people that they can only really be into black metal in a sort of ironic or a funny way, and for them it's very. And I see even bands as well as fans who sort of their issue is like, why does black metal have to be so serious? And it and
Because
then
it's black metal. That's just
yeah,
what it is.
that's the thing to me. It's and then the argument is almost like, the argument is like, oh, people that are into black metal don't have a sense of humor. Or to me it's like saying excuse me, it's like going to see Oppenheimer or The Pianist or whatever, and then saying, yeah, the film was all right, but why didn't they have a joke reel at the end, like they do in American Pie or something? It's like you know what do you say to that?
I understand what you're saying, yeah, and we even had this actual criticism. It was obviously secondhand information, but I remember someone, this was maybe like a few years ago, saying to me, well, some promoters or a lot of people in general always say, well, Trivex is too serious. I was
Right.
like, what do you mean too serious? Like, we happen to mean what we do as artists. Do you want people to do everything half-assed? Does that mean
Yeah.
we're, yeah, like, like as people, like you said, it's not to say that we don't have a sense of humor. I would argue, like, for example, just a couple of episodes ago, where I had Dogger from Miss Therming and Bjorn from Darvaza, both elite level black metal bands who are at the very top of the underground thing at the moment that we're talking about, bands that absolutely take what they do seriously. And I would say that that episode is arguably probably the funniest episode of Iblis Manifestation so far,
Yeah.
and that's that doesn't take away from what they do, and what they do doesn't take away from the fact that we are still human, believe it or
Yeah,
not,
absolutely.
and the point of the art is to explore the inhumane side, that part of us that's somewhere else, that part of us that doesn't fit into the world of, oh, I'm gonna go do some grocery shopping.
Right.
There's that
Yeah,
other
I mean,
hidden beast
the
that we
foundation of
explore.
black metal is that it's not every day. I
Yeah.
think that's one of my issues with UK black metal. It's not just the UK, but British people. One of the good things and the bad things about British people is there's a sort of level of self-depreciation and kind of, if you take yourself too seriously, then people will kind of, your friends perhaps or other people will pull you down a bit. And there's a good aspect of that because
Mhm.
I think English people are maybe quicker to self-depreciate than, well, definitely than some other nations.
I've
And
definitely experienced it, so I know exactly
yeah,
what you're talking about.
I don't, there's so much piss taken amongst friends,
Yeah.
and that's all really good. But the problem is in black metal, I think that people often feel self-conscious about presenting something which is very serious, and so and this is what I always say to black metal bands. Um, Not to sound patronizing, but maybe like younger black metal bands, is not to sort of demystify what you're doing. Don't it's not a good look to sort of, it's not a good look to be too, we all go shopping, I remember Fenres once said to me, like, nobody wants to see Yul Brymner on the toilet. Like, obviously he was an actor playing these very otherworldly cowboys, right? Now everyone knows that he uses the toilet, goes shopping, does whatever he does, picks his kids up from school, or has to get on the phone to the mortgage guy, or all this mundanity, right? But no one wants to see that. And if you showed that in the films, like Clint Eastwood, he goes into the town, and he's this otherworldly figure. It doesn't follow him into the bathroom, or it doesn't kind of show him like his arm gets stuck in his shirt or something. It's about kind of building this, presenting. It's about choosing what you present, right? And everyone knows that even the most serious black metal band has to, even like touring to me is like a massively mundane thing. There's so much mundanity. You have to do pretty tedious stuff. You're in the back of the van sleeping, or you're on the plane, and it's like everyday human being stuff, right? But you don't need to show all that. You don't need to kind of, like, black metal is supposed to be about connecting with something bigger than yourself. That could be, whether you believe that to be like Satan, or an ideology, or whatever word you want to use for these things, a darkness, a greater concept, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you're trying to present something that is not entirely human, or not entirely of the human experience, right? So
Absolutely, yeah.
don't undermine that by then, you see British black metal bands doing interviews at a festival in front of some Portaloos or something, and it's, having a laugh. And it's like, it's great to, have a laugh, but don't do it on camera. And, it's undermining it. Like, if I listen to a black metal, like it, I always say to people, like, would Ishan have done this in 95, or whatever? It's a kind of a joke, but it's like, when I listen to Nightside Eclipse, it's this sort of tour de force, and it conjures up so much, right?
Mhm.
I wouldn't have wanted to then have, as a bonus on the CD, like a video of Isham going to Burger King and having a laugh at the chips or whatever. That would just take away from it, And it's
Now
so
that you say it,
obvious.
I really want to see that.
Yeah, well, now it probably would be okay, but it's like,
Yeah.
you can't. It's like a magician. No one applauds the magician once he's shown how you do the trick. And it's not that it isn't, there is a sort of theatricality about black metal, and it's not, it's not supposed to be kind of too literal. And I think that's the problem. I think that's maybe where some of the bands, yeah, UK bands, I think UK bands have always had a bit of a problem with kind of being too serious, because as a culture, if you're too serious, people kind of pull you down a bit, and that's sort of, that's another way there's a tension with black metal, I think. And it doesn't mean you have to be like all corpse paint and nails. And if you look at Winterfilleth look like very normal blokes, and they are quite normal blokes, but they're very serious about what they present. And it's like they're not going on stage and like, all right, lads, yeah, let's have a bit of a laugh. And it's presented as being the works they make have serious lyrics and concepts and music, and they present it as such. It's not like the guys that worked on Schindler's List or something. It's not like they're always going to be deadly serious, but you're not going to have like a blooper reel. That would undermine it. So you don't. That's a big bit
I
of black
think
metal. It's not that you have to be serious, but black metal itself is, by definition, kind of a serious form of music. So therefore, don't undermine it by kind of being too everyman. That's what I think is a little bit of an issue, and something that bands didn't used to do. I think bands used to understand that there needed to be that distance, and I think that's the biggest challenge for bands today, is that the distance has gone because of social media. And I always cringe a bit when I see someone in a really good black metal band, and then they're sort of posting on Instagram what they had for dinner or something. It's like, it's not that's sort of taken away a little bit of it's taken away a bit of your mystique, and it's taken away the focus from your art in a way. And I think that's tough. I think a lot of these bands that maintained their anonymity during the 90s, they wouldn't have been able to do it now because of Facebook and Instagram and whatever else. So the challenge for black metal bands in this era is to kind of, not undermine or cheapen your art. I think that's a big part of it for me.
I think you make an extremely valid point. This was something that I always used to think, like, even, I don't know, I would say as far back as our first EP, I remember specifically thinking that. But there's a multitude of different dimensions that are attached to this. First and foremost is the actual managing of social media, because most people just don't know how to do it. And my main advice is always, even if you don't have a business to promote, to treat it like it's business. So this thing that you're about to say, is this something that would be good for your business or for your assets if you had that or not? And then always judge everything by that. Even if it's a joke, even if it's a humor, how does that actually serve what it is that you're trying to do? And I think that's the filter which I operate through, and that's the filter that I think everyone should be doing that with. Now, everyone has obviously different priorities, they have different goals, and
different ideas about what about what is kind of too much.
Yeah, precisely.
Has a different line.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that first and foremost, you gotta learn how to be yourself, because a lot of, I think, black metal artists, this is something that's, I think, a lot of difficulty attached to this, especially for the younger artists. And this certainly applied to myself. Like, to me, there was a period of time, and obviously, when you're a young adult and you're exploring things and you happen to have Gigi Allen and Quorthon as a role model, then you can find yourself in pretty crazy situations, exactly just as I did. And thank fuck I survived them, because they were some were even quite dangerous. And this is not even just in Iran. A lot of this is even in the UK. When I first moved to the UK, I was a fucking maniac, and obviously for a good reason, but like, people might see me now being like, oh yeah, so fitness coach, this and that, podcast host. No, I used to be fucking crazy, like most people. Like, if you ask Soli, our bass player, or Matt, our drummer, they will fucking tell you. But the thing of it is that, I think there's a difficulty of finding yourself as a human being
what your beliefs are, what are your values, and then B, finding a proper way of presenting that without having to compromise it. You know, like if I
Yeah.
have a conversation with someone, whether it's on the podcast or in person, I no longer have to think about, oh, I should make myself look like this so it becomes more appropriate to me being a black metal artist. I no longer think that. And you know, it's a freeing thing to come out of that prison, because first and foremost, I believe in my art enough not to feel like I have to project a certain type of image just
Mhm.
to befit that. And the other part of it is that you have to consider that most people who get into black metal, particularly from the artist perspective, there's usually a problem. There's a deficit of something within their personality, within their lives, within the experiences that they've had, you know. And I think that's also part of what makes it beautiful, is that those of us who follow this particular counterculture, it's the cracks within people that bind us all together, you know, and bind us with this music, is those emotional scars that a lot of people have, or perhaps even, you know, a certain degree of anger, which a lot of times may be fueled by logic, it may be fueled by experience. A lot of people feel that anger from the point of view of simply being atheistic and wanting to rebel against their religion that they're surrounded by, that tells them what to do. A
Mhm.
lot of people want to just find something that's larger than life, because they feel a degree of insecurity, because they
Right.
feel a degree of they want to have a weapon that they can hide behind, you know, that you can hide behind the black collars of don't
Mm.
fuck with me, don't come near me, I listen to this music. You know, there is, I think, that sort of psychology that's attached to a lot of it. And I think that in today's world, that's a lot more difficult to try and navigate, to the point that you do present yourself the proper way as an artist, but also,
Mhm.
secondly, you do at least get to be able to your authentic self, which again, not many people can say that about themselves, whether it's in even in metal or not. Forget black metal, a lot of people, I'm sure, wouldn't really honestly be able to say that about themselves. But I think I think that's the point, you know. So for me, when it comes to, let's say, how I interact with people through social media, the filter which I have found to be the most valuable is to, first of all, treat it like a business, and second, it's just the acknowledgement that it takes a lot of time how to fit your ego and your style of communication within that space, because it is
Yeah.
almost rarely ever an accurate representation of what it actually is.
Yeah, and I think, but I also think like there's a few things to unpack there. I'm not sure. It's very hard to measure whether black metal and extreme metal has people that have more anger or issues in the way you were saying, because I don't know how you would ever. I don't know how you would call it without being, as into, like, if I was part of, I don't know, motorsport culture in a big way, then I could look at those people and see, like, are those people, are they more sort of grounded or stable? Or my suspicion is that people in black metal are not. It might be true. It's a tough one. There's a possibility that people that get into black metal are, as you say, kind of looking to fill gaps or having those emotional issues. But my
It's a
suspicion
music
would be
of
that,
retaliation. That's the way I look at it. It's a weaponized form of counterculture. That's the way I see
sure,
it.
but I'm not sure that if you get, I'm not sure that if you went into hip hop, you would find less of that. I
That is
think it's
also
just,
true.
I suspect it's just that we mix more with metal people, so we see that. I do think, like, people that get into black metal in the past, it's a bit different now because it's more accessible. But I think in the past it was definitely full of people that probably had strong feelings about the the culture around them, or religion or society or human beings, or I think there's definitely that. That's true. I'm not sure if people are necessarily it'll be an interesting one to sort of conduct a study. I mean, you do get these studies every so often. I know there's one that you often see posted on social media where it said like, you know, metal people. There's been a few. It's the conclusion was that, you know, the study was to see whether are metal people more angry or violent, and it always comes saying like the most grounded, happy people, or you know, are metal people. I'm not sure if that. I suspect that's not true either, but it doesn't seem, at least, like they're less well balanced than other members of society.
But the big difference, I agree, and I'm aware of this study that you're saying. The way I'm approaching it is, so to conclude that those feelings are present, whether it's feelings of inadequacy, feelings of rage, feelings of despair, of solitude, loneliness, all of these things may be true, but what this subgenre is doing is that it's filling that, it's giving a home to those feelings. So of course, as a result, most of the people, so when I was saying that people might be more angry and this and that, not very often you actually see people in this style of music that act in a violent way or act in an angry way, because the music has given home to those emotions.
Possibly, yeah, that might be true. It'll be. I think it's one of those things where it's almost impossible to say, because it's such a. I don't know how you would research that, but you know, it would be interesting to wonder and to look at whether, because I think metal as a scene is it's very easygoing, actually. You know, I think a metal gig. I mean, I go to hip hop gigs, and metal gigs are definitely more easygoing than hip hop gigs.
Yeah.
People are more grounded, I think, and more calm in a way. I don't mean more calm when the band is performing, but just there's much less like tension or clashes or whatever.
Well, the best conversations about that you have with security guys. You know,
Right.
I've spoken to many, and they always say the same thing. They rarely have trouble at metal shows, but like at R&B shows, like people get fucking stabbed all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, I put on the first extreme metal club in London. I'm pretty sure we were the first people to be playing extreme metal after 11 o'clock. You know, there were pubs that had it, but we were doing it until like 3:30 in Camden, and the venue we did was an R&B and garage venue, and so obviously we would talk to the security, and they loved our night because there was no trouble, or very rarely, and it's definitely true that, you know, I mean, R&B is such a calm type of music. I mean, hip hop can be very aggressive, right? Grime can be very aggressive. There are other types of music, non-metal music, that's very aggressive, but R&B tends to be very non-aggressive music. You know, it's basically sex music, or, you know, that's the sort of, it's very smooth and all the rest of it. But it has, you know, it tends to have, like, statistically has a lot of issues at the events. So you could argue, like, are those people not getting their anger out through the music? Maybe. Or maybe just like metal does, you know, I suppose that would be an interesting question, is does metal attract people who are more balanced and calmer generally, or are they more, as you're saying, are they more calm and grounded because they listen to aggressive music? I don't know. That would be an interesting one.
And I think a lot of it is also, you know, being a human is, first of all, a very complicated experience. You know, it comes with all these emotions and all these baggages that sometimes we just can't really understand or describe where even they're coming from. And it's a lot to sort through, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all the above. I think that a lot of times, just because you feel something as a person doesn't mean you know how to express it.
Right.
And these things can build up and they can boil up. And I think this is how you have fucking mass shootings and things like that.
Right. An extreme example of that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But I guess going back to black metal and metal, I think that, you know,
it gives us that expression.
Yeah.
That's what it does. It gives us the ability to be able to express these things. As I put it earlier, gives home to these emotions.
I think so, yeah. But I think also that I personally don't think that a black metal musician needs to come across as a fully balanced human being. You know, I don't think you need. Well, I think black metal suffers from overexposure, and that's why so few black metal videos and films work. And that's why I was very happy with your video, because it didn't do that. But so much black metal, once it gets on camera or social media, which are both kind of, you know, social media is like the big bright camera of a film crew. It's like it overexposes people, and I think it's good to be a well-rounded human being. But I don't need to see all that. You know, let's say you have a band like Gorgoroth, and then I don't need to see Roger showing how he's in touch with his feminine side, or how he's like working out his anger in a very good way. Or that's great as a human being, but it's like you don't need to show all that. And I think maybe that's the danger with social media, not just in black metal. I mean, you can see how many comedians and film stars and pop musicians go wrong because they show something that just shouldn't have been shown. And it's not like it was something wrong. I mean, sometimes people get caught out being stupid. Like if you post something racist, obviously it comes back to you, and that's your own stupidity. But sometimes you might show, like a black metal musician might show something like so for example, Robin from Mysticum's a good friend of mine, and he's a very funny guy, and you know, we have a very similar sense of humor. Guys from let's say Jim from Heathen Deity, you know, these are people that I regularly talk to on, let's say, WhatsApp or Facebook, and we would send each other or talk and make each other laugh. You know, that's an important part of being a human being. But I don't think it need to see like Mysticum being funny, you know, in a sort of public way. It's like, that's good. I'm glad that those guys have a sense of humor as human beings, as most black metal and human beings do in general. But it's like, you don't need to necessarily show everything. And I think it's very easy to overexpose yourself as a musician and then as a band. And I think that's a little bit of an issue. And it goes back a little bit to what I was saying about post-black metal, and the rest of it is that I think a lot of bands almost feel like they shouldn't be too serious now. It's almost gone the other way. Like in the 90s, bands were so overly serious, it almost became like too much. You know, like if you read the old interviews, which is why, to plug my new book,
there it is, you know, ladies and gentlemen, Evolution of the Cult.
There we go. So that's why big book, 3.5 kilograms. That's why I included so many of these old interviews with bands alongside new ones, to show kind of how, you know, bands, these human beings have can show more depth now. And in the 90s, it was like every band was claiming to be a satanic murderer, and you know, I'm being facetious, but it's like it kind of went so far that you couldn't believe it. And then you met these guys and they'd be quite normal human beings. But it's almost gone the other way now, where bands feel like they're not allowed to be serious and they have to be a bit jokey because that's what social media demands, or that's what their scene demands. And there's probably a balance in there where you don't need to present yourself as like a 100-year-old count in a castle and whatever. But you also don't need to be like, you know, the Jack the Lad on a sort of stag do, you know.
Yeah. No, I understand exactly what you're saying with that. Also, regarding the book as well, I mean, just talking about these characteristics, you know, I mean, what can you tell us? I mean, you said how many people you had on there? 160?
There's 165.
165.
Some of that varies from, you know, 5-hour interviews to quote, you know, like much shorter quotes. So there's probably like 100 key people, and then 65 people who have done smaller parts. And you know, you might have one guy giving his opinion about it. You know, one thing I did, every chapter starts with people from bands talking about other bands. So it's not just, so for example, it's a Satyricon chapter. You have somebody from what X band talking about, why they were inspired by that band, or I mean, just to take a random. My
And then
mind's blank.
the
Let's
Watain
have a
one,
look.
you had Sterla from Svarti Dowdy basically talking about
Right.
the band.
You remember
Yeah.
it better than me, you see. So okay, so let's say Watain
Yeah.
chapter, right? So you have Venian from Von, obviously. Watain took the name from a Von song. You have Esther Segara, who's done most of their photography. You have Roy Christensen from Imhotep fanzine, and as you say, Sterla from Svarti Dowdy. And so it was a little bit about not. It doesn't just need to be me as a writer saying why these bands are important. It's more about having the bands discuss. A lot of the book is about how bands are took influences from other things. So that's a big part of it. And so yeah, that's kind of the core of it, is kind of letting the musicians speak for themselves. And not only, so when you have a chapter, not only do you have the musician giving their story rather than me kind of, this book isn't about me telling you about a band as such. It's allowing the bands to speak for themselves, but it's also allowing other bands and musicians to point out kind of what they took from it, and why was Blasphemy important to the bands that came later, why was Burzum important to Mork, whatever. It could be these connections. So yeah, that was the key. But yeah, if including all that, it's 165 people, so it's pretty definitive. And
I mean, it's crazy. I mean, what I know that I guess we've kind of covered this, but what even prompted you to want to do such a project of this magnitude? I mean, I have to say, I don't think on the record I'm saying this, as far as I'm aware, I do not think there's ever been any project of this size where it definitively puts black metal in such a well produced piece of literature like the one that we have got here, with an
thank you.
abundance of sources as well, obviously.
I mean, that was the aim, not to sound arrogant, but I wouldn't have released it if it hadn't achieved that. The goal originally, obviously, so for people that don't know, I guess a lot of people have seen the original. I'm just going to see if I have it here. Probably not, but the original version, actually, maybe I do. Have a look. No, not here. Okay. So obviously a lot of people saw the original Evolution of the Cult, and that was written between 2009 and 2013. And the gist of that was, the drive behind doing that was to kind of set the record straight, and let the artists tell their story, and also to kind of show that black metal was this movement that started in 1980 rather than 1991, to talk about bands like Masters Hammer, Rotting Christ, Von, Sarcophago, to put all these bands in that framework, and then also to show how it went on from there. So it didn't end in 94 in Norway. We talk about Black Legions and black metal from I mean, just to give you an idea, like there's obviously a large section on Norway, but if we don't know if the camera will pick this up, but this is the contents, and this is Norway, so it's obviously a big chunk. But it also has,
that's about a fifth or a quarter of the whole thing, and there's a hell of a lot of content for anyone just listening onto the audio. There's basically like 1 million chapters there.
Right. You've got 72 chapters. There's sections on Greek black metal with Rotting Christ, Necromantia, Divisor, and then you've got early Finnish black metal bands like Beherit and Pale Nazarene. And all these bands are interviewed, an exclusive interview. So Venom, Merciful Fate, Bathory, Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, Mr. Fire, Blasphemy, Samael, Tormentor, Masters Hammer. So there's all this stuff before the whole Norwegian wave happens, and then there's all this stuff afterwards, whether that's bands like Psy, or bands like Absu and Agalok, and from America, and UK black metal scene, and so it was to build up a broader picture. That's the whole point of the book, really. And in a nutshell, when I released the book originally, it was done through an American publishing house, and I was given a sort of maximum word count, and it wasn't enough to tell the whole story for me. And so I bought back the rights for the 10-year anniversary. Spent the last year just working pretty much exclusively on this book. Cult Never Dies normally releases on average 4 books a year and maybe 2 records. And this year we only did this book and the Trivax album. So it was, it was a kind of all encompassing thing. And
I feel honored.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good. But yeah,
well, I mean, I think the two complement each other quite well, really, if I may say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the point of this book was kind of to rewrite and include all the stuff that wasn't in the original, include all the stuff from the last, rewrite the stuff that I wrote in 2009, because obviously you become a better writer, and stuff that I wrote then I wouldn't write now. And then I guess to sort of expand on things that have come since. So, we would talk about Winter Philith, or we would talk about, I should say. I'm just looking. So in the original, you had a chapter on Shining, and that was kind of representing depressive black metal, whereas this book has Forgotten Tomb, it has Bethlehem, Interviews with Forgotten Woods, Streed. And so, yeah, it was kind of just about having the space to tell a broader story. And, because this is released on Cult Never Dies, and Decibel. So Decibel had done the US edition, Cult Never Dies has done the rest of the world edition. And so there was no limit, and this, I would dare to say this is probably the longest book on metal ever, on any type of metal ever released. I mean, it's 340,000 words. 600,
and it's high quality. It's the quality of the book, the design, just everything. It is so well written. Like, it is, for a book of this size, there is absolutely nothing half-assed about it, if I can say anything.
There's no filler.
No.
It was really like a lot of the work was kind of cutting things. It's finding that balance where you're trying to squeeze more details into the word count, and even with 340,000 words, you have to kind of keep shaving off any extraneous stuff, or just cramming it full of detail. And so yeah, I think it's really a new book. It obviously has a similar title to the book I released 10 years ago, but it is essentially a new book. And in the last year I did, I think, well, the original book had 80 interviews, so I must have done, let's say, there's a few of them were archive interviews, but yeah, I mean, around 100 interviews in like 12 months. And it was intense. It was intense. It was 40. I was working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, and it just became my life, really. That was and I guess I'm also aware that I will probably never release. This is sort of my magnum opus, not to be too pretentious, but Cult Never Dies will continue to release books, obviously, but I can't imagine that we'd ever release another book this big, because I don't think anyone's ever written a metal book this big. In fact, I know they haven't. I mean, there are books that are as many pages, but not as many words and as much content. So it had to be perfect in my eyes. Like, it had to be complete. And even though it was quite stressful getting it done, and to be fair, quite stressful for Decibel, because Albert had to edit things last minute. We were working against the wire in terms of time, and a lot of long sort of sleepless nights. But it had to be. There was no point doing this if it wasn't going to be. The whole point was to be definitive. So there was no point releasing something that wasn't, in my eye, and just making it as good as it could be, really. So I think this is the realization of what I was aiming to do back in 2009 when I started. And
would you say that this could be looked at as perhaps the definitive black metal Bible?
I don't think you could write a book about the creation and evolution of the first 30 years of black metal without simply repeating stuff that's in this book. I think that's the key, really. Like, that you can write more. I mean, the book mainly focuses on 1980 to, let's say, early 2010, sorry, early 2010s. Goes a bit beyond that because all the bands that are featured, we follow them up to date if they're still making black metal. So obviously, like, you have a band like Profanatica, right? They have their own chapter. There's an exclusive interview. Profanatica is a band that are probably most famous for what they did in the early 90s. So a lot of it's about that. But, they're still releasing albums now and going on tour. And so we follow them up to date. But what I mean is there's not that many bands there's no bands in it who formed in the last 10 years.
Sure, I understand.
So
I love that Profanatica photo with the three of them on the streets with their dicks out.
Yeah, that's in their garden actually. That was in Paul's. I think that was in Paul's back garden.
Yeah, I remember. Dayal, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I actually found this. I saw that photo as a teenager when I was still in Iran, and then me and my friend, we were like, we had never seen much of American black metal, and then we saw that, and then we were like, wow, this is the shit.
I think I actually have it here. I don't know if you can you show this on? Can you show this on the camera? Is it any censoring problems?
I'm sure it'll be fine. Yeah.
So this is for those that aren't aware, this is
So that's the black and white version, but there used to be another version.
This is the original.
Actually see the blood as well, right?
This is the original press. So it's and it includes these lion words that this would be the last ever release, and that's 93. So we've obviously seen, or 94. Obviously seen that didn't come to. They've been released about 6 albums since then.
Yeah. They just did one not in the last few years, didn't they? I think it's great. There's that kind of, I guess, shocking aspect to it and the different personalities involved. But yeah, I think you've really done a fantastic job. I mean, just to sort of, I mean, we don't want to give away too much about the book, but if there's anything I can say,
you can give away anything you want, really. It's not
sure. Yeah, but I think it's a good one for people to try and want to read for themselves. I mean, first of all, I love the fact that it encourages people to hold a book in their hands and read, right. Because I feel like there's so much stuff out there, like to me, the way I look at metal, the way I look at black metal is that partaking in it is a statement of itself, itself. So for example, like let's say you're on a train journey, I think, like for example, when you're wearing a metal t-shirt where it's got, I don't know, it's like you got the volcano logo on the front, that to me is a statement. It's like, yes, I'm wearing the t-shirt of a band that was, that released one of the best metal albums in 1986 in Brazil that not many people know about, and then there's that kind of a thing, And I think it's the same with a book. That's an additional way. Like, let's say, for example, if you're sat on a train and there's people everywhere, and then that is the book that you're holding in your hand.
I mean, I feel like the one criticism you can make of this book is that maybe it's not the easiest book to take on a train, because it's a bit. I mean, the original book maybe, but most of our books, most of the books Cult Never Dies release are in A5 format, which is almost a bit less than half of this. It's probably not so much a try. It's a coffee table book, really, I guess.
But also,
you could take it on a train. You can take it whenever you want. But it's.
But exactly the thing that black metal is larger than life.
Absolutely, and you have to be sort of dedicated. You have to suffer for your.
For your art, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
There you go. I think it makes perfect sense.
And what you say, there is some truth in a sense, because there is a physicality to it. It's a huge book, and we haven't made a digital edition. I'm not saying we never will, but in 10 years we haven't. And there is something about keeping a sort of print alive. I think there's parallels to be made between that and, say, vinyl. As a band, not just releasing MP3s. As a publishing house, we don't just do ebooks. We don't even do ebooks. And
would you do an audiobook?
Well, people do have asked. It's not that I'm told. There's some people in Cult Never Dies who say we should do no ebooks ever. And then I'm a little bit more. I'm not going to say never. I'm not going to say we never would do an audiobook or an ebook. But obviously, I prefer if people buy it or borrow it or whatever and enjoy it as an object. And also because a big part of it is, there's so many photos, and I don't think. I mean, if let's just take a random, well, not so random. If I show you that, it's very different to looking at
That's
that on
awesome.
a little Kindle. You know what I mean? Like,
I agree completely.
this is, if you want to, so the Watain section, it's like there's a clear difference between looking at an image like that and having it and read, and the sort of physicality of it, and then looking at that on and I use Kindle occasionally, so I'm not against ever doing it, but I think for this book is so much about the visuals as well as the story. I think you wouldn't get quite as much, but it is something I've thought about. There's a guy who supports our stuff, and he's registered blind, so he was asking if I could do it, and that got me thinking a bit. Like, there's a few people, there are people who can't see a book, and so for them it would be better as an ebook, because I think then it can read it, it can, it automatically audio whatever, it reads the book to you or whatever.
Sure. Well, if you ever want it, I'm happy to narrate it for you. But
you need to book a few weeks off for that one.
Yeah, I
So
think
it's a lot to read.
Yeah, of course.
But I think maybe an ebook we could do it one day. But definitely initially it's about physicals. I think, as I say, that there is a parallel to that. Well, even with the Trivax album, we have the vinyl, we have the CD. It's not like it's slightly different because, of course, you can listen to it on Spotify or YouTube. But I'd feel like if you're really into a Trivax album or any band's album, you'd probably I have a hard time believing that you can get as much from just listening to digital files as you can from having a physical.
Well, listen, I think
I've got a vested interest in saying that, because obviously I want to sell your album and any other albums we release. But still, there's a reason why I have a record collection and not I don't have a Spotify account, but I do think there is something about there is value in the physical.
Well, I 100% agree with you on that. I think what's special about the book is that it complements the physical aspect of metal. Like, I think, and yeah, it's absolutely the same with the Trivax album, because or any proper real metal album where you get to hold it. You get to hold it in your hands. You get to stare at the cover, and your eyes can follow the different details all across the cover, and you can get lost in it. I remember even doing that as a child with like VHS covers. Like when my parents would buy me a VHS film, I would spend an hour just staring at the cover, looking at all the different details, the different emotions that were displayed. And I think,
and holding in your hand, there is it has presence. These things.
Yeah, and I think that there's like almost like a sense of creating an egregore when you're holding that thing in your hand and you're staring into it. Even I would love to see like a scientific study of what happens when you stare into something with your eyes. It almost like feels like you're giving it life by believing in it, And this is precisely the reason why, with my close friends and musicians all across the world, that I do like shirt trades or things like that. I always make a point of writing a handwritten letter to them and sending them that, because to me that's very important. I've done this.
There is value in the,
Yeah.
There is a value in the physical, and on a practical level, I think vinyl. The process of playing a vinyl is so different. I mean, I listen to vinyl every day because I'm in a position where I can listen to it when I work. But I do think it's the best way to listen to music, because for three reasons. Firstly, you have the physicality of the sleeve. I think is obviously you can't get a vinyl out of a sleeve without looking at the sleeve. So that brings something to it. But on a sort of more maybe practical level, there's a sort of it's a bit like when the Japanese tea ritual. It's like you enjoy something when you go through the process of focusing upon it. It's a bit like when you do something in a casual way, you can never get as much from it the more you put into something, the more you get out of it. So that process of putting the vinyl down, it kind of centers you upon that and you focus upon it. But thirdly, I think at least for guitar music, vinyl does sound better in my opinion. It is. I listen to all formats, but I do think, for metal, it's very rare that a CD and especially a digital stream sounds as good as a vinyl, if ever. I don't think that.
No, it always sounds better. That's why you always get the cases of you listen to an album on vinyl and then you start hearing things on it that you never did on a
Absolutely.
CD.
Yeah. And it's got a warmth and a presence, and assuming you have a decent setup, it has it's less cold. I mean, I think all of that makes it work. All of that applies to the book in a way as well. I think just like I say, I do use Kindle and I use Audible and things like that, but I can't be as invested in it as I am if I'm holding a book and reading. It's just not. I don't think it's possible.
Absolutely.
It's too abstract in a way. It's not. We're physical creatures. To some extent, you have to sort of. I'm not a collector, but I do think that if you have something that's of value, that it's better to. And I think that's another reason why the metal underground. That's one benefit we have, is that people do kind of understand that physicality and to collect. I guess there's a collecting element as well to it, but there is an understanding of physicality that you don't have in some scenes, and that's also allows bands to make income on tours. Whether it's merch or CDs or vinyl. I think there are some scenes where, especially younger scenes, where the fan base don't really buy music. And they don't understand the value of buying music, and that probably isn't very sustainable in the long run, because unless obviously you can sell T-shirts, but you can't just make a living from selling. Some bands can, but it's quite hard to make a living just by selling T-shirts and playing shows. And not every band wants to be playing shows, so then it's even less chance of.
Yeah, and I think that there's also the perhaps somewhat superstitious, but also still it still rings true, and it's that once something is in physical format, then unless you destroy it, then it exists that way eternally. Right. That's why when people buy Trivex records or even T-shirts, to me, that's like that's a physical extension of the legacy. That's to me, that's crazy, because it feels like a part of me now officially lives on someone's shelf at home, at a place I've never been to, as as in the format of flesh and bones, but a part of me is still there because it resides within that art. It lives and breathes in these physical things, and I think that's why it's important, and that's why I highly encourage everyone to go and check out the book. I think that one thing that, like, as the shortest and the quickest review I could give of it is simply the fact that we always argue about quality over quantity or quantity over quality. Well, in the case of Evolution of the Cult, I would say it is quality and quantity, and plenty of both. So
that's a good. I'll take that.
Absolutely. Dayal, been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast, man.
Thank you for
so
having
much for
me.
Jumping on.
I hope I didn't rant too much or go off on too much of a tangent.
But that's what we do, right?
That is my way.
No, it's awesome, man. It's great. It's actually kind of a good excuse anyway. I mean, we talk pretty much all the time sorting out the Trivex stuff, but it's great to get your wisdom attached to this, And
I don't know how much wisdom I have to offer, but hopefully a few grains here and there,
You do have that to offer, man. There's no need to be modest, and I really actually think that we should probably do more episodes at some point in the future, just to talk about other things and perhaps even unpack some of your history. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to let people know where they can check out the book, where they can buy it?
So if you're based in America, you can buy it from Decibel Books, or if you're South America, that's probably still the cheapest way in terms of shipping. Otherwise, go to cultneverdies.com or cultneverdies.myshopify.com. That's our main store. And there's also links from there to our EU store. So if you're based in the EU, we don't have as much stuff, but we have all the core books and records that we've released. So if you're based in the EU, you can also shop there. But yeah, cultneverdies.com has information on all this stuff, and that's a good starting point. Obviously, this is our 27th book, so we obviously have we have books on death metal, doom metal, fanzine anthologies. We've done official biographies for Paradise Lost, Rotting Christ, Obituary, Mortis, Moonspell. So there's also, it's not all black metal. There's quite a wide range of literature, and I think if anyone is anything more than a passing interest in the subject of metal, there's something there to enjoy.
Absolutely. Yeah, man. I mean, fair play to you. I think there's just as we round this up, there's one thing I really have to say to you, and this is something that I appreciate about what you do, and I think this is exactly the reason why we both ended up working together. And I think it's the fact that when you look at all of those different books, when you look at all the different releases, when you see that massive CD shelf behind you, when you see all of these things, there's one thing at the core of it, and that is passion.
Right.
And that is passion that breeds massive projects like this, that breeds those 12 to 14 hour days and everything that comes with this. So I thank you and I respect you for that. And I encourage everyone else who has perhaps even an ounce of that passion in common to go and check out your book. Dayal, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And to everyone else listening, I'll see you guys on the next episode of Iblis Manifestations. Cheers.